Welcome again, Dr. Stefan Lund. His presentation now will be Slavery versus States' Rights, the Seceding States' Rationale for Disunion. So what was going on in those mines down south that led to the Great Conflict? Stefan?
All right. I have been made aware of the typo on the thing up there. For those of you hoping to learn about states' rights, I'm afraid to disappoint you. The morning, I've talked about the folks in the north. It's now in the afternoon, and it's time to talk about the folks in the south. So, as you all are no doubt aware, the causes of the Civil War, and specifically the role of slavery in causing the Civil War, has been more or less constantly litigated since about December of 1860. You know, how you describe the role of slavery in this conflict changes our understanding of the hostilities. So, you know, this makes sense. If slavery is central to the war and integral to the cause of the Union, then the U.S. Army defeating the rebels and emancipating the enslaved is heroic. But if you were to portray slavery as relatively marginal, as one of many factors that led to the conflict, then the Southern rebels could be portrayed as just another of many unsuccessful 19th century attempts at national liberation and independence. And so, while the consensus among historians for over half a century has been that slavery was the primary and instigating factor in the rebellion, I've been interested in why debates over this topic continue. I mean, there are certainly pro-rebel partisans engaged in motivated reasoning to conclude that the influence of slavery was negligible. But what I'm really curious is is how the kind of it wasn't just slavery narrative can attract even just well-meaning, curious people. Why I, for example, as a young person, thought that thinking there was more to the war than slavery made me smarter. But and thinking about this a bit, a couple possibilities come to my mind at least, or two main ones, I should say. First, it can be difficult. It can be hard to appreciate how deeply slavery was woven into American society. The tariffs are a common example of this. International trade policy was an area of debate that often took a kind of sectional tone, with pro-tariff support being concentrated in the North and anti-tariff sentiment being concentrated in the southern states. To the untrained eye, this looks like a separate issue from slavery that may just, be drawn along similar lines. However, once you realize that many white Southerners' opposition to tariffs is grounded in a belief that they will hurt trade and hurt their ability to sell the agricultural staples they produce, agricultural staples that they produce with enslaved labor, then it becomes clear these aren't really separate issues at all, that disagreements about tariffs are absolutely wrapped up in the politics of slavery. The same could be said, the same is true with other areas of disagreement during the antebellum years, such as Western expansion and the development of infrastructure. North Carolina Congressman Nathaniel Macon once put it, quote, "If Congress can make canals, they can emancipate." That is, some slave owners like Macon feared to empower the federal government due to what it might do if enslavers ever lost control of it, which eventually they did, and they rebelled. Western expansion, meanwhile, was, again, an opportunity, certainly, but it posed some of the same sort of threat that men like Macon feared. If the West is populated by free states, the congressmen and senators that those states elect might outvote Southern enslavers and consign them to a permanent minority status in their own country. And so, in short, things like tariffs, infrastructure, national expansion, these don't immediately make the modern reader think slavery. But the more one learns, the more one realizes that in many ways, in many ways that were very clear to people at the time, these debates are tied inextricably to the fate of slavery in America. So that's one reason. It's a little difficult to appreciate from a distance of a century and a half how much these things might be tied up. But another reason why I think even well-meaning people could get confused along these lines is that the primary source record itself can offer contrasting accounts of the role that slavery played in actually provoking the war. At some point, every diligent student of history learns that the best sources are typically those produced closest to the events in question. But, sorting this out in practice can prove kind of tricky. On the one hand, you can point to the words of Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, where he declares that, quote, all knew that is slavery, was somehow the cause of the war. Or a speech from Frederick Douglass a year earlier, where he rhetorically asks, what is the cause of the war? And then he answers his own question by saying, quote, we all know it was slavery. However, a diligent student of history might also encounter the words of Alexander Stephens, writing immediately after the war, that the rebels went to war to oppose, quote, the demon of centralism, of absolutism, of despotism. Jefferson Davis, also writing after the war, talked about regional hostilities being the reason for the conflict. And that these hostilities, quote, were not a consequence of any difference on the abstract question of slavery. Of course, even Lincoln, again, famously wrote in a public letter, quote, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And so, with the first time you encounter primary sources like these, the words of people who lived through the war, you may conclude that perhaps the war is about slavery in some sense for Northerners, but maybe not about emancipation, and Southerners might have had other goals in mind, and perhaps this is all a business of, the whole business about slavery is just the two sides talking past each other. The problem here, of course, I spend a good chunk of my weekdays emphasizing this to high school and college students, is the need to read these primary sources critically, to really think about the circumstances that produced these words. Written words are tantalizingly useful for trying to reconstruct the thinking of people long gone. Not only are they very easy to preserve, but they are prone to the vagaries of memory. Once pen is put to paper, words are not easily changed. But writing has some real downsides. People may lie. People have biases. People may not write about the things that a historian is interested in studying. And so we examine what we know about a source to try to understand, get a sense of what is, in what sense is what is written here true. Perhaps the writer believes that they have written the truth, but they are mistaken. Perhaps the writer has presciently observed the state of the world, and with the benefit of the hindsight, we could say that actually we could conclude they had remarkable insight. Perhaps the writer is deliberately trying to mislead us, us, the people of the future, trying to set down a record that will cause us to view them in a more charitable light. And so this brings me to the actual real topic of this lecture, the 2001 book, Apostles of Disunion, Secession, Commissioners, and the Causes of the Civil War, by the historian Charles Dew. This is, in my opinion, one of the most useful books about the Civil War published in the last 25 years. For one thing, it's short. I did write pause for laughter in my notes. No, but seriously, it's just over 100 pages if you include the introduction and the after. You could read this in an afternoon if you are so inclined, which makes it easy to, recommend to readers of all ability, including students. Who are sometimes a little iffy on doing the reading. For another thing, though, it speaks directly to the central animating question of this era of history. What caused the Civil War. By examining the words of people in the midst of the secession crisis, Dew zeroes in on the weeks in which some states opted for secession and then ultimately war, and others did not. Third, Dew's treatment of his sources in clear, readable prose serves as something of a clinic of how historians examine sources, how they may judge some to be more trustworthy than others, and why. Identifying patterns in the sources he discusses, Dew demonstrates how knowledge about the past is created, how we come to generalizations about the events of bygone days. We are both blessed and cursed with a flood of books on the Civil War era, and so as Ron Myers and I were discussing possible topics for these lectures, the idea of drawing attention to this little book and what it had to teach us intrigued me. And so, having burned a good chunk of my time musing on why this subject piques my interest, I want to spend the rest of our time together examining this book, what it has to teach us about the direct causes of the Civil War, and what we know about the past in general. The subject of Dew's book, as you may have guessed from the title, is the words of the secession commissioners. These commissioners were ambassadors of sorts, men sent from several of the seceded states to other slave states that had not seceded. They were sent in order to convince those other slave states that had yet to secede to take the plunge, to embrace secession. They're apostles of disunion. As of February of 1861, as everyone is no doubt aware, there were more slaveholding states outside the newly born Confederacy than in it. If it came to war, and the jury was still out on whether it would, the rebels would be hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. The goal of these commissioners on some level is to even those odds, to recruit more states to the rebel cause, to bolster their ranks and save slavery in the South. These commissioners and the words they used to galvanize support for secession during the uncertain winter of 1861 are the topic of Dew's book. So to get some numbers out of the way to start, all in all, there were 52 commissioners dispatched from 5 slaveholding states. Now, Louisiana only sent one guy, and he arrived in Texas after they'd already voted for secession. So we're mostly talking about delegates from 4 slave states: Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and of course South Carolina. These commissioners, they're not the most famous fire eaters or the legends of Southern politics. Those guys were primed to take on real jobs in the actual government. These commissioners were mostly men with middling political careers, judges, newspaper editors, sometimes a prominent farmer or doctor. Their primary qualifications were reputation for effective oratory and a strong tie to the state that they were dispatched to. In fact, many were returning to the state that they had been born in. Not all of these men were long-time secessionists either. This isn't just they aren't just assigning these jobs to the most dyed-in-the-wool secessionist folks. Some had been holdouts, only recently convinced of the necessity of secession, and now dispatched to encourage their fellow Unionist Southerners to make a similar transformation. There's no systematic rationale for where these men are sent. Again, you will have noticed there are different numbers sent from different states. Some states, like Alabama and Mississippi, for example, sent commissioners to every other slave state. South Carolina, however, only sent commissioners to the 9 other states that had already called secession conventions. Georgia dispatched 10, 5 to sister states in the Deep South, and 5 to slave states like Virginia and Missouri that bordered freedom. These commissioners delivered speeches, they penned public letters, many of which were reprinted in newspapers across the South, and for the book, Dew relies on about 41 of these speeches and letters, which he provides 2 of in an appendix. In many ways, these speeches and letters from these secession commissioners are ideal historical sources. They were produced in the midst of the secession winter. When evaluating a source, is generally speaking, the closer you get to the incident in question, the better. Knowledge of the past can bias how we remember what we did or said and why. And so contemporary sources are very useful. These speeches also speak directly to the question at hand. Why did these Southerners believe secession was necessary? That's actually their whole point, to convince other states to secede. And there's no need to tease out what the author is talking about, because their goal was to say it in the plainest possible terms. Why secede? I'm trying to tell you. The timing, like I said, the timing and the subject of these speeches make them very useful, but there's a third feature of these sources that makes them just incredibly valuable, which is who they are addressed to. These speeches are persuasive documents aimed at the leaders of the fellow leaders of slaveholding states. These are potential comrades that the speakers hope to win to their side. This is useful because the speakers believe that they and their audience share fundamental ideas and interests, so they can be straightforward and candid about what they are doing, why they are doing it, and why they think their audience should join them. Finally, and crucially, we have an abundance of these speeches. Again, there are dozens of commissioners dispatched from multiple states to many other states, and we have, as I've said, more than 40 of their speeches and writings. And so, if there are similar themes or topics that appear in many of these speeches, we can be confident that these were important, motivating reasons for secessionists as a whole. All of this is not to say that these are infallible historical sources, just that they have many of the strengths and few of the weaknesses. And for that reason, we can consider these speeches some of the best evidence we have on why, that, as we'll soon see, slavery and race are absolutely central to the secession movement. These commissioners, they were very clear that it was the election of Lincoln, an anti-slavery Republican, that was the catalyst of the secession movement. In the words of John Archer Elmore, Alabama's commissioner to South Carolina, the election of Lincoln was, quote, an avowed declaration of war upon the institutions, the rights, and the interests of the South. William L. Harris, Mississippi's commissioner to Georgia, agreed, saying that the election made clear that the North was, quote, more defiant and more intolerant than ever before. Harris went on to explain, quote, they have demanded and now demand equality between the white and Negro races under our Constitution, equality in representation, equality in the right of suffrage, equality in the honors and emoluments of office, equality in the social circle, equality in the rights of matrimony. He continued, our fathers made this government for the white man, rejecting the Negro as an inferior, ignorant, barbarian race, incapable of self-government and not therefore entitled to associate with the white man on terms of civil, political, or social equality. In short, said Harris, Lincoln's administration meant, quote, freedom to the slave, but eternal degradation to you and us. For anyone that was still unconvinced that secession was about preserving slavery and protecting white supremacy, other commissioners were happy to clarify. Alexander Hamilton Handy, Mississippi's commissioner to Alabama, warned that, quote, the moment that slavery is pronounced a moral evil, a sin by the general government, that moment the safety and the rights of the South will be entirely gone. James L. Orr, South Carolina's commissioner to Georgia, similarly declared that South Carolina would, quote, would never submit to such an equality at the ballot box, jury box, and witness stand. John McQueen was a South Carolina congressman who actually resigned his spot in Congress to go preach secession in Texas. Before he left, he addressed some Virginians in Richmond, telling them that they must choose, quote, between an association with her Southern sisters or the domination of people who have chosen for their leader on the single idea that the African is equal to the Anglo-Saxon, with the purpose of placing our slaves in a position of equality with ourselves and our friends. For their part, he later told some Texans, South Carolina would never accept, quote, the abolition of slavery and the elevation of our own slaves to an equality with ourselves and our children. Now, we really must thank Stephen Fowler Hale, the commissioner from Alabama to Kentucky, because he wrote a letter to Kentucky Governor Beriah McGoffin where he really pulled no punches. Lincoln's election, he said, is quote, nothing less than an open declaration of war. For this triumph of this new theory of government destroys the property of the South. It lays waste her fields and inaugurates all the horrors of the San Domingo servile insurrection, consigning her citizens to assassinations and her wives and daughters to pollution to gratify the lust of half-civilized Africans. The slaveholder and the non-slaveholder must ultimately share the same fate, he argued. Quote, all be degraded to a position of equality and see our own sons and daughters in the not distant future associating with free Negroes in terms of political and social equality. He concluded, quote, if we triumph, vindicate our rights, maintain our institutions, a bright and joyous future lies before us. And if we fail, the light of our civilization goes down in blood. Our wives and little ones shall be driven from their homes. The dark pall of barbarism must soon gather over a sunny land. Alabama most respectfully urges upon the authorities and the people of Kentucky the startling truth that submission or acquiescence on the part of the southern states at this perilous hour will enable black republicanism to redeem all its nefarious pledges and accomplish all its heinous ends. So what's the point of reading you all that racist vitriol? To illustrate what Dew argues are the main points of emphasis in the speeches and writings of the secession commissioners. If we look at a large body of persuasive rhetoric produced in the midst of secession, we can have a pretty good idea why the leaders of secession believed it was necessary, what they hoped it would accomplish. The first point that secessionists, the first point is that when secessionists departed to convince other states to join them in rebellion, they argued that the slave states must secede, because Republican victory meant the end of white supremacy, and the consequences of the downfall of white supremacy would be horrific. Republican domination would mean racial equality, they argued, and that was unthinkable. The idea that white Southerners would be degraded to the level of their slaves, or that their slaves would be brought up to equality with them, horrified them. Equality with slaves was an unspeakable insult. The word degradation is ubiquitous in these documents when discussing this point. The feeling of deep shame that accompanies the notion of racial equality is palpable. These men were quite candid, that they felt that the end of slavery would make white Southerners a lesser, pitiable folk. This specter of racial equality was the looming threat, the coming social change that must be resisted at all costs, the reason secession was justified. The second threat was that of race war, that is, that the South would look like the French colony of Saint-Domingue, overrun by former slaves and intent on taking their violent revenge. This was the fear among white Southerners that the enslaved would be unsatisfied by Republican promises for equality and would instead seek to violently turn the tables on white Southerners, establishing a new racial hierarchy with the formerly enslaved at the top. This had been a common rallying cry for years. Preventing violent slave uprisings was, for example, the primary rhetorical justification for banning abolitionist literature in the South, like I mentioned this morning. This was essential for justifying the interests of poorer white Southerners and how they are tied inextricably to slavery. As Mississippi Commissioner Thomas Wharton put it, the consequences of a coming race war would be to, quote, extirpate one or the other of the races. Southern whites could not be expected to be spared whether they owned slaves or not, they argued. All must stand together to defend white supremacy and slavery. Third, and perhaps most dire, was racial intermarriage, the idea that social equality with Black Americans would lead to what they called racial amalgamation, the quote-unquote pollution of their daughters and the end of the white race. Some lumped in equal marriage opportunity with other inconceivable social rights the formerly enslaved would gain under Republican administration. Many others, however, tied the sexual threat posed by Black men to the race war they argued would soon arrive. They referred obliquely to the quote-unquote horrors Southern white women would experience, knowing full well that their audience would fill in the rest that went unsaid. The end of slavery did not just mean poverty and indignity, they argued, but the end of the white race as they knew it. Republican ascendancy was not just a threat to their livelihood, but a threat to their national and racial self-conception. In short, Dew argues, when secessionists went abroad to spread their gospel in the winter of 1861, they carried a message of racial apocalypse, that the slave states must leave now, they warned, or lose their white supremacist society, and with it, everything they held dear. Now, in a historical vacuum, I think Dew's book would still be worthwhile. Even if you came to American history entirely ignorant of the past events, geography, I think it's still pretty convincing evidence. These speeches are numerous, so we can observe these common themes and conclude that they likely reflected widely held beliefs and are not, the idiosyncratic thoughts of a lone fanatic. The speeches and letters, again, are directed towards men that the authors considered comrades, so we can be fairly confident these are their honest convictions, not a facade they're putting on for outside observers. And again, the speeches come from the midst of the crisis. We can be pretty sure these are their unblemished thoughts. They have no hindsight or knowledge of how this struggle will actually turn out. But of course, Dew's book doesn't exist in a vacuum. The words of the secession commissioners are of particular importance because they contradict many of the key claims of lost cause mythology about the causes of the Civil War. Dew is upfront about this being the purpose of his book, contradicting the myths of rebel sainthood that he had learned as a child, made it, as he described, a quote, difficult and painful book to write, even for a professional historian decades into their adulthood. Lost cause mythology is intricate and contradictory and seeks to explain away everything from the decades of political conflict leading up to the war, to the military conflict itself, to the Reconstruction period that followed. Our area of interest today is the lead up to the war and secession, so I think we can restrict our scope to just the lost cause mythology about the origins of the war. The historian Alan Nolan has a pretty good list of these, which I'm going to borrow and summarize here. The mythology goes like this. First, that slavery was not the immediate cause of the war. Second, that abolitionists were in fact the hostile provocateurs whose behavior led to the outbreak of the war. Third, that white Southerners were not particularly attached to slavery and probably would have gotten rid of it pretty soon in their own time. Fourth, that enslaved people were content in their position. That slavery was benign and discontent among the Southern blacks was the product of Northern agitation. And finally, that the conflict can be explained as a product of long-standing cultural differences between Northern and Southern whites, without bringing slavery into it. If these explanations reflect the reality of belief and sentiment among the secessionist Southerners, then surely we will find them in the writings of the secessionist commissioners. I hope it will not surprise you at this point when I tell you that no, the evidence from the commissioners' letters is entirely either contradictory or damning in its silence. First off, as we've seen, the guys tasked with convincing other states to secede certainly thought the point was to defend slavery. Alexander Handy, I've mentioned before, delegate from Mississippi to Maryland, put it quite succinctly, arguing that Republicans would, quote, overthrow the Constitution and subvert the rights of the South. What particular rights was he referring to? The right, quote, by which one man may own property in his fellow man. So that's quite clear. Henry L. Benning, a delegate from Georgia to Virginia, was just as explicit, explaining to his audience in the Old Dominion that he and other Georgians had voted to secede because of a, quote, deep conviction that a separation from the North was the only thing that could prevent the abolition of her slavery. Handy and Benning were certainly not alone. The Southern commissioners were unanimous in their insistence that protecting slavery was paramount to the secessionist project. Second, these writings make a very thin case for the abolitionists as provocateurs and hostile enemies. When all of the secessionist fears are hypothetical, the predicted outcome of a Republican administration that was actually had just won an election fair and square. It's difficult to make an argument about the heinous deeds of your enemy when they actually haven't had the opportunity yet to carry out any of those heinous deeds. During that winter, all secessionists could point to is what the Republicans might possibly do in the future. Commissioner John Elmore may have believed that Republicans, quote, now demand equality between the white and Negro races, but it was, in fact, only the secession movement that he advocated for that allowed Republicans to pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments over the opposition of white Southerners. Clearly, the commissioners thought this line of reason would convince white Southerners, but it's not compelling evidence to anyone who doesn't already share their views. Third, the words of these commissioners do not support the idea that white Southerners would have given up slavery or that they weren't particularly attached to the practice. Slavery, they argued, was the only thing keeping them safe from violent revolution and war. Why would they have abolished slavery of their own accord when the relative social equality that might come with it seems to have so obviously horrified them? If slavery was marginal, as to the secessionist causes, some would still have us believe. It's just weird how much they bring it up then, huh? I mean, to quote Benning again, he predicted simply that if abolition were to occur, quote, we will be completely exterminated and the land will be in possession of the blacks. Rather than preparing to phase out slavery, men like Benning, who, again, was chosen by his peers to represent the secessionist cause to others, argued that if Southerners abolished slavery, they would essentially be consenting to their own genocide. Fourth, lost cause apologists may argue that slavery was benign, that the horrors of slavery were rare and overblown, and for the most part, enslaved people were content with their lot in life. Besides the actual testimony of people who were enslaved, which we have now and they had then, this is contradicted by, as many contemporary observers pointed out, by white Southerners' frantic fear of slave rebellion. That is, if your enslaved people are so content, why exactly are you so afraid they're going to cut your throat any chance they get? Why are men like Benning so convinced they'll be killed the moment slavery is gone? The enslavers' counter-argument to this is, of course, that their slaves were content, but it's a Republican and abolitionist propaganda that incites them to rebellion. But this isn't the gotcha counter-argument that they thought it was. If the people you're enslaving are like one pamphlet away from Haitian-style insurrection, I think they're 95% the way they're already. I don't really think the pamphlet's doing it. I think the slavery is what's doing it. So finally, the lost cause argument that's, the final lost cause argument that I want to highlight here is that in actuality, long-standing cultural differences between the northern and southern whites played a defining role in instigating the conflict. There are references to what we might call cultural differences in these speeches and letters, but like the example of tariffs and infrastructure that I mentioned at the outset, it's clear that these cultural differences, the core of these cultural differences was, believe it or not, slavery. Fulton Anderson, for example, a delegate from Mississippi to Virginia, decried Northerners, claiming they were subservient to, quote, an infidel fanaticism, and insisted that Yankees believed, quote, we are a race inferior to them in morality and civilization. Cultural differences indeed, sure. Of course, then Anderson followed this by declaring that because of these cultural differences, Northerners were now on a quote-unquote holy crusade to abolish slavery. So again, in the abstract, the lost cause explanation here is unobjectionable. Few doubt that there were distinct regional cultural differences, and that these probably did contribute to the outbreak of hostilities. But for men like Fulton, those pushing the country towards those hostilities, those cultural differences only mattered because they resulted in a threat to slavery. Dude's book, I think, makes a valuable antidote to these historical myths because of the strength of the sources he's writing from. Again, they're produced in the midst of secession, with the fate of the country clearly hanging in the balance. These documents are numerous, coming from dozens of different writers in several different states, who are all at the forefront of the secession movement. And these letters raise difficult, perhaps fatal questions for the lost cause interpretation of Civil War history. If slavery is a marginal issue, why is it featured so prominently in these texts? If enslaved people were so content, why are these Southerners afraid they'll be killed en masse by the people they hold in bondage? If enslavers would have agreed to gradually end slavery, if only Northerners had been less radical, why do they speak of abolition with such disgust and shame? For anyone with doubts in their mind, Apostle of Disunion kind of kneecaps the lost cause by raising a host of questions that interpretation cannot readily answer. In 100 pages, it clearly answers the question, what do you mean the war was about slavery? By simply demonstrating over and over again how the future of slavery, race, and white supremacy, in the South at least, were on the minds of those advocating secession. When I was introducing this topic, I called Apostles of Disunion one of the most useful books on the Civil War and its causes to be published recently. And I say this, I say this for a couple reasons I've mentioned here. I think Dude does an excellent job of walking his reader through these sources, why they're convincing, how this evidence helps us draw conclusions about the past. But I want to close by touching on Dude's commentary on his own writing and his research process. I think this sort of fourth wall breaking is helpful, a reminder that the history we read are not immutable truths that are arrived at through repeated experiments in a laboratory, but the reasoned interpretation of folks who have done a lot of work to untangle one thread in the larger mess of the past. In the beginning and end of his short book, Dude pulls back the curtain on what writing Apostles of Disunion was like for him, why it was incredibly emotionally challenging, and how it forced him to reevaluate some of the stories that encouraged his love for history in the first place. And then afterward, to the 2016 republication of the book, Dude muses on what he missed the first time around, how he underappreciated the role that the lucrative slave trade between the upper and lower South, he missed, by his own account, the role that this rhetoric played in Southern commissioners' arguments. If you maintain a curious attitude towards the world, towards history, you're going to discover that learning more usually just reveals how much you don't know. You realize what you got wrong, things you overlooked that now seem obvious, that perhaps you took positions that you no longer agree with. And admitting that you may have been wrong is hard. changing your mind is usually even harder. And so I think modeling this sort of intellectual humility is perhaps an underappreciated element of this book. Because as you see, Dew explains in his introduction, I briefly alluded to earlier, that he was a dyed-in-the-wool young Confederate, a quote-unquote son of the South, born to a father named for Stonewall Jackson, carrying a well-worn copy of Lee's Lieutenants, proudly displaying a rebel flag in his 1950s college dorm room. He describes himself as an archetypal devotee of the Southern rebels. Like many young men, it was the passion for battles rather than the Byzantine causes of the war that captivated his attention at first. But he recalls a firm belief that anyone who believed the war wasn't fought to defend the sovereign rights of the South was either, quote, deranged or a Yankee. Although these were beliefs he left behind a long time ago, by the time he started writing this book, he still describes it, as I said, he describes it as a, quote, difficult and painful book to write. To look back and realize that, the rotten core that underlaid so many of your fond memories is difficult. To realize that the beliefs you held so deeply were based on something so flawed is hard. It is difficult for him to admit that such a realization is usually accompanied with shame. It's hard to overcome because many, as Dew seems to still harbor, a nostalgic fondness for ourselves before we learned better. Changing your mind is hard, and it's doubly true when you've invested some part of yourself, your identity, into a belief about the world. Changing your mind then comes with a certain amount of shame, a feeling that perhaps you've been hoodwinked, or deceived, or naive, and people don't like to feel that way, and for good reason. And I think it's valuable to have established historians like Dew publicly question and re-examine their old beliefs. It reminds us that history isn't just a collection of facts, but interpretations made by people based on the best evidence they had available to them. It used to be a fact that the wall we know as Hadrian's Wall was built on the orders of the Emperor Septimus Severus. But then a clergyman working on the history of Northumbria in the early 19th century proved definitively that Hadrian ordered that wall built. Many people for a long time assumed that the first peoples to reach Hawaii and other Pacific islands must have done so by accident, that those ocean distances were too vast to be navigated without early modern equipment, until sailors demonstrated that the Polynesians had in fact developed remarkably accurate navigational techniques based on memorizing the stars and observing the ocean. To bring it back to U.S. history, Thomas Jefferson's sexual relationship with Sally Hemings, a woman he enslaved, was a scandalous rumor until DNA evidence convinced people that it was really true. History that challenges our understanding of the past is often derided as revisionist, but revising our understanding of the past and then subjecting those revisions to scrutiny is kind of the whole point. Otherwise, we'll just keep telling the same stories over and over again until, as Tolkien put it, what started as history will become legend, and legend will become myth. And there's a place for myth in any society, but myth and history, myth isn't history, and confusing the two can be a dangerous error. So it's really Dew's reflection on this sort of transformation, how the beliefs that one held linger and still exert an emotional pull on them after you've maybe left them behind intellectually, reminds of the historian behind the history. Someone has to write the books that we read, and it takes considerable passion and to see that research and writing process through to the end. You leave a lot on the cutting room floor as you craft a narrative, trying to turn a bunch of disconnected letters and journals into a legible account of the past. And Dew's book is effective in part because he's writing about what convinced him. The evidence that helped him turn his back on an understanding of the causes of the war and Southern history more general. An understanding that the secession movement was, in large part, an effort to preserve white supremacy. To those who think that finding suspicious, Dew basically says, yeah, that was me too once, but look, here, I'm going to show you what changed my mind. As I said earlier, the flood of books on the topic of the Civil War is a blessing and a curse. And I hope I've convinced you that Apostles of Disunion is worth your time, if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. It is, as I promised, short, and you can read the whole thing on a rainy afternoon, if you wish. It speaks to one of the most enduring questions of our period. What did cause the Civil War? And third, do offers a lot of insight into the making of history, what makes some sources more useful than others, and how the historian themselves wrestles with the creation of history. Thank you.